Well, good morning. On behalf of the Michigan Council for the Social Studies, my name is Stan Masters. I would like to welcome you to our last day of our virtual conference, The Stories We Tell, Accounts, Anecdotes, and Authenticity. We've got another great day of learning for you, and we're real excited to get started today. In just a couple minutes, we will be inviting our keynote speaker to the stage, Dave Serio. But first, we have a couple of conference etiquette things to go over and a brief word from one of our amazing sponsors who made today possible. At the end of each session, please take the session survey. These are individualized for each session, and the results will be shared with the presenters. You will find the survey down at the bottom of each session description page in both the conference app and the web platform pictured on this slide. Every session survey that you complete gains you another entry into our conference drawing for one of 10 free copies of We Interrupt This Broadcast, a book with audio CDs partially written by Monday's keynote speaker, Bill Curtis. To catch a session recap later, come back to the session page in a couple of days. We know that we have most of those available right now, and the rest of them, again, will be finished up soon. You'll have access to the entire conference worth of learning for several months after the conference is ended. And this is a great way to catch extra sessions that you may not have been able to watch live because another session interested you. There's up to 18 sketch credits available for live attendance at the conference. We'll be running those Zoom reports to confirm your attendance, but as a backup, we recommend that you type in your name in the chat so we can check the chat logs if there's an issue with reporting on the back end of Zoom. We will compile things after the conference is ended, and you should get an email from MOEX about the conference survey within 2 to 3 weeks after the conference is ended. If you do not receive this notification, first please check your spam folder and then email info@mcssmi.org for assistance. And we'll send you the link to the Google form you need to complete via the app notifications and to everyone via email. While attending a session, be sure to keep your microphone muted unless the speaker has requested verbal feedback. This will help make what the presenters are saying clearer, and both for the people attending live and those who are going to catch that session later. You're welcome to keep your video cameras on or turn them off. It's up to you. We recognize that most of you are attending the conference from the comfort of your own home. If pets, children, or your spouse interrupt you viewing our sessions, just smile and shake it off. It's old hat at this point, and we're all used to it. Again, for sketch credit, be sure you type in your name in the chat once you have entered the Zoom room for attendance purposes. You're also welcome to use the chat feature in Zoom to ask questions of your presenter and to communicate with your fellow conference attendees. If at any point today, if you're having trouble with the conference app or the web platform, shoot a quick email to Dave Johnson, djohnson@mcssmi.org, and he'll do his best to get you up and running. This conference would not be possible without the help and support of our amazing sponsors. By sponsoring the conference, our exhibitors have helped offset some of the costs of running an event like this one. You can visit all of them in our virtual exhibit hall anytime during the conference. Many of them have set up appointment hours and have lots of valuable information about the products and services they provide. Today's conference sessions are being sponsored by American History Tours, and we thank them for their sponsorship. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to Dave.
In spite of all of our best preparations, our sponsor today is actually going to be the DBQ project. And that you now know I used the same PowerPoint framework to build all of our daily things. So I'm going to share my screen, and we've got a brief video from our friends at the DBQ project that I'll share. And then we will move into the final moments here. So, all right.
When we launched DBQ Online a couple of years ago, we knew that our work was just beginning. That's because we wanted to hear from you, to see how you and your students were using the platform, and to learn how we might improve it. Well, with students and teachers viewing more than 100 million pages of online content, making more than 10 million online annotations, we have a few new features that we wanted to tell you about. The first is our robust Manage tool. The word manage doesn't quite do it justice. It's really a souped-up, multifaceted way of providing interactive feedback. Whether in the classroom or from home, a teacher and her students can work and dialogue simultaneously at every stage of a unit. She can see when a student has analyzed and marked up a document, for instance, and can immediately comment on her work. For their part, students can quickly see their teacher's comments, make any changes, and then move on to the next task in the process, knowing all the while that their teacher is looking over their digital shoulder.
I think, when you're really near to them when they're working, they kind of turn it on and they work really hard for you because they know that you're watching. And I think this feature makes them realize that, at any point I can pull this up and look and see what they accomplished during that time that they had, and kind of gives them that internal thing of thinking like, oh, she's going to be looking at my work, so I want to do my best.
When a student has turned in a draft of her essay, the Manage button on the teacher's page turns orange. Clicking on that, she can either write a comment or use one of our preloaded comments, all of which can be color-coded. Together, they can go back and forth like this through multiple drafts. The second big change to DBQ Online is right up here. That's right, on every page of every unit, we provide a Spanish version of the text. A teacher simply has to enable the English-Spanish toggle when she assigns a unit, just as she might with other optional features, such as the audio read-aloud or the essay builder. With these and other improvements, our goal remains the same.
That is getting kids to write more clearly, argue more persuasively, to read more closely, to dialogue with each other, and to use evidence-based approaches to solving problems.
To that end, DBQ Online still includes several popular features.
These include the ability to annotate text with arrows, highlighting, sticky notes, buckets, and telestration.
To find the definition of any word or explanation of a key term or concept.
To enlarge maps, graphs, and other images.
To hear documents and background essays read aloud.
When we went up the river in the morning, it was just about light.
To customize assignments.
To differentiate material per each student's needs, integrating scaffolding directly into the instructional flow.
And to help students build their essay step by step, making it possible to complete a paperless DBQ unit.
It just feels like it's part of a continuum of thought that leads you to a particular place with a reasoned argument. And it's a natural experience, not something that they're fighting their own instincts and creative thoughts.
Above all, we want to help teachers make the curriculum truly their own. So when you assign a unit, in addition to customizing and differentiating the material,
you'll now get a prompt asking if you want to include teacher instructions.
This allows teachers to mark up a unit before students begin working on it, posting sticky notes, inserting reminders, or reframing a question.
So I have a sticky note here that asks them to include hashtag summaries, which are kind of like a play on Twitter or Instagram hashtags, where the students will put a hashtag symbol and then one or two words that summarize that paragraph.
Using the Layers tool, students can either view or hide the teacher annotation layer. Finally, teachers have asked for the ability to include a co-instructor.
If I'm sitting there next to a first-year teacher who's never taught a DBQ, I could be invited to the class, see what they're doing, provide feedback to the actual teacher, and maybe just be a support.
If there's any part of the process you don't quite have a handle on, or if you'd just like some new instructional strategies, we have a library of over 40 professional development videos available to online subscribers.
We helped the Union Army greatly, and then the Union Army was able to free all the schools.
It's been a lot of fun making this leap online. And if you haven't yet given DBQ Online a try, let us know.
We look forward to hearing from you.
All right, our friends at the DBQ Project have supported
Thanks,
the
Dave.
conference for years. So I will pass things back over to Stan now.
Thanks, Dave. And again, thanks to our friends at the DBQ Project. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our keynote speaker, Dave Serio. Dave is an education and public programming specialist at the Arab American National Museum. He holds a MA in Near Eastern Studies and Arabic from Wayne State University. Dave joined the Arab American National Museum in January of 2011. As an educator and public programmer, Dave conducts educational presentations and workshops both in person and online. He also helps in the planning and implementation of youth programs and cultural events, such as the Sura Arts Academy, a youth photography program. Dave's like us. He wears multiple hats, including volunteer coordinator and curator of the Arab Film Festival, and oversees all subsequent film programming at the Arab American National Museum. He also proudly serves on the board of the Anton Art Center, the Macomb County Pride, Friends of the Detroit Film Theater, and DAFT. On a more personal note, Dave identifies as a third-generation Arab American whose family comes from Lebanon. He dabbles a little in the film industry and is a proud cat dad of two, and is always up for a good political debate. This time, please welcome our keynote speaker for today, Dave Serio. Dave, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dave and Stan, for that warm welcome and for including myself and, of course, the Arab American National Museum to be a part of this wonderful conference. And thanks to everybody for tuning in and being willing to listen to me and, allow me to talk a little bit about the Arab American community and the stories that we tell and how we do that exactly. Couple of interesting notes. I didn't realize that I would get more than I bargained for political debate wise. I've since retracted that after the last 4 years. And also what a difference COVID makes. You wouldn't be able to tell that photo was me. It's like night and day. Anyways, with that being said, really happy to be here. Again, my name is Dave Serio. I oversee the education department at the museum. And of course, wear many hats like Stan so wonderfully introduced. What we're going to do today is I'm going to go over a couple of major points, tell you all a little bit more about the Arab American National Museum, the work that we do, highlight the different types of stories that we tell and exactly whose story we're telling and in what formats. But to kick things off, and then lastly, share some educational resources with all of you. To kick things off, though, since not everybody's familiar with the Arab American National Museum, I'm going to start with a short video clip. It's about 2 minutes long. It'll introduce you all to the work that the Arab American National Museum does, and then we're going to go into my presentation. I'm also going to be asking you some questions and some interactive pieces as I go through my presentation. So since there's a decent amount of us, I would ask that we all maybe use the chat as I ask some of these questions. But again, trying to make it as interactive as possible. So I would love to hear some of your feedback. And if you have any questions at any point while I'm in my presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat. And I'll either try to get to them in that moment, or if I miss them, unfortunately, I will we can revisit them at the end of my presentation. I'll try to leave some space for some Q&A. All right, so with that being said, let's pray that technology is on my side today. And
among the 35,000 museums across the United States, there is only one museum that tells our story, and only one museum that elevates the Arab American voice and inspires the generations of today and the generations to follow. A thoughtful narrator of history, a passionate advocate of justice, and an innovative expression of our identity, the Arab American National Museum has served as the heart of Arab American storytelling, making its mark in the world of art, science, and culture. Brought to life by Access in 2005, The creation of this crown jewel and Smithsonian affiliate was guided by Access's vision of a just and equitable society that includes the full story and contributions of Arab Americans. Emerging as a powerful reclamation of our narrative in a space that has been dominated by ignorance and misconceptions that have threatened our cultures, traditions, and truths, the Arab American National Museum preserves our story and shares our contributions with the world. Locally and across our nation, we offer a history created by you to sustain a future that will be built by you. Since the very beginning of time, storytelling has been a way for us to navigate and discover our world. It is what heals us, unites us, and inspires us. Whether it is stories, songs, paintings, photographs, films, textbooks, novels, or poetry, the beauty and contributions of our unique and remarkable community are captured through the history and art that live on in our treasured Arab American National Museum.
Oops. All right, so that should give you an idea at least about who we are as the Arab American National Museum, and as a fun way to test out the chat. I'm just curious, folks who are tuning in, has anybody ever been to the Arab American National Museum? I always like to see if folks have been to our institution, if you're familiar with who we are. So if you have, this will be a good icebreaker for for the chat. To kind of kick things off. Oh, okay. I'm seeing lots of chats come through. Okay. Some yeses. Oh, 3 times. Okay, beautiful. Not yet. Now I have to go. Beautiful. Okay, cool. Great. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so I'm seeing a few folks that have been before, and I'm seeing a few folks that have not, but maybe plan to, which is really, really wonderful. So let's jump into the presentation that I prepared. So of course, again, we are the Arab American National Museum, and can you go away, Bar, please? Hopefully you'll go away. Anyway, so again, we are the Arab American National Museum. We are here, of course, to document, present, and preserve the history, culture, and contributions of Arab Americans. We are the first and only museum of its kind in the entire country doing this type of work. Which of course makes us an essential institution, right? So there's nobody out there telling the story of Arab Americans on a national platform like we are, right? And so we were established May 5th, 2005. So we're younger as far as other institutions across Michigan go. But again, in that short amount of time, we've done some really amazing and impressive work. So of course, being the only institution of its kind is of course something that we like to gloat about, although we hope in the near future that there will be other institutions doing this work just because of the importance of this type of work. We're also a Smithsonian affiliated institution. So if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., to the Smithsonian, we are an affiliate of them. And which is an amazing honor to be affiliated with the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. We are also accredited by the American Alliance of Museums, which again, if you're in the museum world, that's a really amazing honor to have. And we achieved both of those before we hit our 10-year mark, right? So in our 10-year mark, we've been able to achieve really amazing kind of, check marks on our list. And we're of course continuing to grow as time goes on. Coming up to our 16th anniversary this May. And of course, so again, like I mentioned before, again, our goal is to really share the stories and experiences of Arab Americans. And of course, this is very important because again, nobody's doing the work that we're doing, but also because oftentimes, especially with minority communities, including the Arab American National Museum, and of course you can include many other groups in there, there are so many other other voices that are trying to tell the story for these minority communities, and again, including the Arab American community, right? And so when the idea of the museum was initially formed, this was in the late 90s and early 2000s, a bunch of folks got together and they said, hey, there's really nobody out here telling our story for us accurately, right? You have folks that are telling our story from a political lens, which of course is very problematic, and we can talk about that if folks are interested. You have voices from the media that are trying to tell our story, which again are riddled with stereotypes and inaccuracies. So we really need a space for us to tell our own story through an accurate lens from the voices of folks in the community. And so these conversations were had in the late 90s, early 2000s. And of course, this all culminated into the Arab American National Museum. And so what we're going to do before we get into the heart of the presentation is we're going to do a little icebreaker. I know it's kind of Saturday morning, and I don't know if all of us are fully awake. I am throwing my hat in that listing as well. But I always like to start off with an icebreaker. So we're talking about Arab Americans. That obviously that's the focus of our institution. When you hear these words, Arab American, what are some things that immediately pop into your minds? It can be anything, right? So what pops into your mind when you hear the word Arab American?
They speak Arabic.
Okay, so language might be a piece of that, okay? I'm seeing culture in the chat, seeing amazing culture, Casey Kasem, right? So specific folks, specific geographical areas in the US and or overseas. Language, identity, architecture, discrimination, differences between generations. That's really great. Thank you for that. Great. These are language. Absolutely. Great. So these are all really wonderful answers. Thank you everybody for sharing. And yeah, these are all things that come up in a lot of folks' minds, right? So there are some really great things like food and clothing and culture and language, but then of course there are some other things that negatively come up, right? So stereotypes, for example, like there are stereotypes that might come to folks' minds, right? And so our job again, of course, is telling the accurate personal stories of the Arab American community. Also, it's talking about the rich diversity that exists in this community as well. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of an icebreaker, and I want you in the chat to share with me if you recognize either of these individuals, or if you don't, can you tell me something about them? Maybe their career, something you notice about the pictures. So in these two photos, this is pretty easy, but can you tell me who these folks are? Great. Rashida Tlaib. Okay, so we have Rashida on the left, and wonderful. We have Tony Shalhoub on the right, Monk. Absolutely. Very good, everyone. So we have Rashida Tlaib, who is a lawyer and the first Palestinian American woman in Congress, also one of the first Muslim American women in Congress who represents Michigan's 13th Congressional District, recently won re-election. And on the right, you have Tony Shalhoub, who is very well known, I think, in the acting realm and in TVs and films. He's most famous probably for his for the TV show Monk. So again, both have this identity of Arab, being Arab American, but both come from different parts of the Arab world, right? We have somebody whose family comes from Palestine and somebody who comes from Lebanon, but both are under this identity of Arab, right? And we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. What about these folks? This might be a little harder, so this is more of a challenge, but I'm curious. Oh, he was on Wings. You're right. And Taxi, I think. Wasn't he on Taxi? Maybe not. What about these folks? Do you know who they are? Or again, if you don't, can we tell anything about them based off these photos? Good guess. It's not Madeleine Albright, but that's a really good guess. She looks very much like Madeleine Albright now that you mentioned that. Good, Stephanie. Yep. So we have a journalist on our right, and we have a scientist on our left. Very good. Great, Rebecca. Yes, absolutely. So we have Helen Thomas, who is here on our right. So she's a very famous journalist. Here we go. So she's a very famous journalist. She's Lebanese American, was known as nicknamed the Watchdog of Democracy. She had covered, I believe, presidents from President Nixon all the way up until Obama. Very long, healthy career. And on the left, you have Ahmed Ibrahim, who is an Egyptian-American scientist and was the first Arab to receive a Science Nobel Prize for his work in chemistry. So again, both have this identity of Arab American, both come from different parts of the Arab world. We have Egypt and Lebanon, both have different physical characteristics. But again, this identity of Arab is something that, that they both identify with, okay? We have two more. One of these probably is pretty easy, and the other one might be a little harder. So again, do you recognize either of these folks, or perhaps could tell us something about them based on their background? Oh, I don't know Helen was in films. That's interesting. Okay. Okay. So I'm seeing Hadid. Hadid on the right. Bella Hadid. Okay. Great. So one of these, again, Bella Hadid is probably a little bit more familiar with you all than the individual on the left. But again, both are Arab American and both are doing really, great work in the community. So on the left, you have Yemeni American Debbie El Montazer, who's an educator and activist based in New York City. She's known for her activism and interfaith work. She was also one of the, I think she was the founding principal of the Khalil Gibran School in New York. So that's, I think, how she got a little bit of name recognition beyond, a little bit larger. And then, of course, on the right, we have Bella Hadid, who's a little bit more well-known as kind of a pop culture icon, also a supermodel, voted Model of the Year in 2016. Again, both have this identity of being Arab American. Both come from different parts of the Arab world. We have Palestinian, we have Yemeni, different maybe physical characteristics, different dress, different things like that. But again, both fit underneath this umbrella of identifying as Arab American. Lastly, this one's probably also a little hard, but again, do you recognize either of these individuals, and or can we tell about the work that they're connected with based off of their photos? Okay, good guess. Not a comedian, but that's a really good guess. You're kind of in the right realm. Oh, good job, Nicholas. Nobody's ever guessed Jeff Johns by name. That's awesome. Yep, that's exactly how you spell it too. So on the right, we have Jeff Johns, who is, of course, involved in the comic book world, as you can see. Okay, I'm seeing broadcasting, spoken voice poetry. You're close. Kind of think of another art form that we all most likely listen to. Oh, TED Talk, good answer, good answer, but not quite. Very good. Hip hop, rap, singing, right? Absolutely. So we have both of these individuals. So we have Amir Muhammad Al Khalifa, who is better known by his stage name Odyssey, who's a Sudanese-American rapper and record producer based in New York, who's been making music since the early 2000s. And on the right, you have Jeff Johns, who is very well known for his work in DC Comics. He's worked on Green Lantern, Aquaman, Flash, and Superman. Again, both have this identity of Arab American, but again, both come from different parts of the Arab world. We have Sudan represented here on the left and Lebanon represented here on the right. But again, both fit under this category of Arab American, right? So what does that mean, right? Again, we're talking about Arab Americans. We're talking about folks that come from some of these countries. We've identified a few of these countries, but of course it's important to talk about these countries fully. So this is a map of the Arab world. And there's a lot of information with this. So we're going to kind of pare it down just to get to the rest of the presentation. But a couple of really interesting points with this map. First off, notice that we don't call it a map of the Middle East. We identify it as a map of the Arab world. So all 22 of these countries are considered to be Arab countries based off of 3 unifying characteristics. And you all had mentioned a few of these in the beginning, but there are 3 unifying factors that identify these countries and simultaneously leave countries out, such as Iran and Turkey. So for example, the reason Iran and Turkey is often lumped in with most of these countries, at least in Southwestern Asia, is because of this term Middle East. And the Middle East is really a term that was coined by the British when they were ruling the world, especially back in the day. And what Britain did is they kind of sectioned off the world as they saw it in relation to them, right? So anything very far from Britain was nicknamed the Far East, right? So China, Japan, those countries. Anything very far close to Britain was nicknamed the Near East, and the Middle East just happened to be this blob of land in the middle of kind of their empire, if you will, right? How they saw the world. So the Middle East is not an accurate term if you're talking Arab-specific, Arab-centered things, right? Which is why this map might look a little different from the map of the Middle East that we often see in our classrooms or textbooks and things like that. Now, again, there are 3 unifying factors of the Arab world that unify these countries together. Any thoughts? And I know a few of you mentioned them earlier when we were talking about what pops into your mind, but just curious. So what do you think unifies these countries together? So there are 3 unifying factors. Okay, they all speak Arabic, so they have Arabic as their main language. Very good. Okay, so I'm seeing a few different pieces here, and we'll talk about each of them. Oh, these are really great. Wow, great. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, these are spot on, right? So there's a couple major things that I've seen come through the chat. The first we'll talk about is language. So language, of course, is the first unifying factor. All 22 countries speak Arabic, have Arabic as their official language. But of course, you have other languages spoken here as well. You have English, French. Some countries have specific dialects as official language, as their official language, like in Somalia, they have Somali as an official language. So it kind of varies from country to country, but of course, all 22 countries have Arabic listed as its official language. Now, when we talk about unifying factors, because at the end of the day, these are 22 independent countries, we also talk about some of the differences. And I'll just kind of go through these quickly, but with language, of course, you have the similarities and the differences kind of within that title. So for example, the unifying aspect is more of the very proper Arabic, right? So the Arabic you'll find in schools, university, newspapers, news reports, things like that. That is where the language is very constant, right? So if I am in Libya and I'm speaking to my friend in Qatar, and we both speak this proper Arabic, we're able to communicate very easily, right? Because there's no change in the language, right? The changes and the diversity really focuses on the dialects within these countries, right? So the dialects can be very drastically different from country to country. Even within each of these countries, there are quite a bit of dialects that can be different. And again, you can take the US as an easy example of that. Of yes, we all speak English is pretty common, but of course you do have other languages spoken in the US. And then even within English, you have different dialects and accents and things like that. Culture was also mentioned. So there is a shared history and culture between all 22 of these countries. Of course, again, there's similarities, but there's also differences. One of the easiest examples of this, I think, is hummus. We've all tasted hummus, seen hummus, smelled hummus, been around hummus in some way. And so that's a really good example of like the similarities, but also the differences. So the similarities with hummus, for example, would be the ingredients you use, right? So we have chickpeas, crushed sesame seeds, garlic, lemon juice, salt. These ingredients you'll find all across the Arab world, but how they use these ingredients in each country is really where you see the diversity, right? So for example, if you, hummus is very common in like places like Lebanon, Syria, the Levant area, but if you go to Yemen, Somalia, Morocco, you're not gonna find hummus as a main staple dish, right? So again, there's that similarity and also that difference. Lastly, I think a few folks mentioned it as well, is membership in the Arab League. So the Arab League is like a mini United Nations, if you will, where all 22 countries belong to this organization. And the Arab League helps out with economic, cultural, and political issues. And so those are kind of, again, the 3 unifying factors. Religion was also mentioned in the chat, which is a very commonly guessed answer. But religion is actually not a unifying factor. And that's really important to bring up. So it's often understood that, Islam is simultaneous with Arab. And of course, that's not the case, right? And even though that's not what all folks think about. And oftentimes, if you watch the news, if you see films, if you're watching some of the mainstream media, it's often kind of rolled into one term, right? Arab equals Muslim, Muslim equals Arab. And of course, that's not the case. You have large Christian populations throughout much of the Arab world. You have a very large Iraqi Christian population known as Chaldeans, with a huge presence here in Metro Detroit. You also have large Christian communities in countries like Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt. About 10% of the population is Christian, and kind of beyond that. So you have Christian communities throughout the Arab world. You also have Arabs who connect with the Jewish faith. So you also see Arabs who practice Judaism in some countries such as Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco, and beyond that as well. Small populations, but still very old populations and populations that continue to live in these countries. And again, you'll have religions that folks connect with outside of those major monotheistic religions as well. And as a good example of that, as an Arab American, I could change my identity. I could change my religious affiliation 7 times in 7 days, but I still keep my Arabness, right? I still keep my Arab identity, if that makes sense. So that just gives you a sense of the different countries that we're representing at the Arab American National Museum. It also gives you a sense at how challenging, how challenging it can be to tell the story of folks coming from these 22 countries, right? So, and that's something we'll talk about in a minute, is how does the Arab American National Museum make sure that we focus on folks coming from, the stories of folks coming from 22 different countries, the vast religious diversity from the Arab world, the vast physical characteristics, right? You want to obviously make sure you don't just have white passing Arabs, right? You want to make sure you have representation from Black and browner, Black and brown communities, right? And so again, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is just showcases the community, but also kind of shares with you a little bit of the challenges that we have as an institution to make sure we have diverse and equitable representation in the stories that we tell in our institution. Lastly, to end kind of with this portion and go into more of our storytelling component, this is just a little cheat sheet. So again, we talked about how religion is not a unifying factor, although you do have a lot of folks who are Muslim. It's not the whole population. And even within Islam, you have many different sects, ideas, traditions, beliefs. So again, even that Arab Muslims are not a monolith, correct? And then also, again, if we zoom out to the Muslim world, right? So if we look at the Muslim population across the world, you'll notice that Arabs are a very small minority within that population, right? So Arabs actually make up a very small minority of the total Muslims on Earth, right? And then again, bringing it home, if we look at the Arab American population, the breakdown, it's pretty evenly split, right? So you have about 50% of Arab Americans who are Muslim, 50% who are Christian. And then of course that comes with a little asterisk because you also have, again, Arabs who identify with Judaism, also again, religions that Arab Americans connect to that are outside of these major monotheistic religions as well, okay? Hopefully that wasn't too much information, but hopefully it gives a decent shot of kind of the Arab American community. I'm just gonna take a look at the chat just to see if there's any comments or questions. Love hummus. Did somebody say not a fan of hummus? I will respect that. I'll respect that. Let's see. So we have a question from Chalk. Why isn't Iran part of the Arab world? That's a really good question. So just to follow up with that, the reason it's not part of the Arab world is because of the factors that we had just talked about, right? So, so for example, language is one of the unifying factors. Iran speaks a different language. They speak Farsi, which is very different from Arabic. So they have a separate language. They also have a different cultural and historical connection, right? So if you talk to many Iranians will say, no, we are not Arab. We are Persian. They're very proud of their Persian roots and Persian culture. And so many of them will identify with Persia and Iran's unique cultural and historical past, if you will. And then they're also not part of the Arab League as well. So the 3 unifying factors we talked about for the Arab countries is exactly why Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, which is very close to some of the Arab countries, that explains exactly why they're not Arabs, because they don't harness these 3 unifying factors. See, and then we have another question. If the majority of each country speaks Arabic but have other language, why doesn't the same rule apply to religion, where there might be other religions, but Is this really a political attempt to de-emphasize the contentious nature of religion? That is a really good question. So the question is, like, if a majority of folks speak Arabic but have other languages, why doesn't the same rule apply to religion? That's a really good question. And I would say, even though other languages are spoken, like, the language is really the major language that's spoken, right? So even if I speak another language, so for example, if I'm Chaldean, so a lot of Chaldeans will not identify as Arab. Some do, some don't. It really depends. It's a very personal choice. You still speak Arabic, right? So Chaldeans in Iraq, they speak Arabic, they understand Arabic, it's a part of their life, but they also speak their unique language as well. With religion, it really depends, right? Even though Islam is dominant and is a very large, dominant religion in many of these countries, for example, in other countries, it's not necessarily the case. Lebanon, for example, historically, Lebanon has a huge Christian population. At one point, Christians were the largest population of, Christians were the largest religious sect within Lebanon. That has since changed, but the Christian population is very, very large in Lebanon. And again, there's sizable Christian and Jewish communities in a lot of these different countries. And again, religions that go beyond that. Not to mention, again, that religion also, if we use religion as a unifying factor, that would eliminate literally half of the Arab Americans in the United States from identifying with where's it going with that? If we use religion as a unifying factor, that would eliminate about 50% of the Arab American population from being Arab. If we use Islam, even though it might be the dominant religion in the Arab world, for the Arab American population, it's about half and half. And so that would take away that identity from them, and you just can't do that. Because again, think of it this way too. What if everybody tomorrow converts to Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism? Does that take away their Arab ethnic identity? It can't, right? But that's a really good question. I appreciate that question. That's a really powerful question. So thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about Arab American stories and how we tell the story of Arab Americans. We'll hit on a couple of different points here. So of course, when we tell the story of Arab Americans, of course, we're always striving for accuracy, right? We want accuracy in telling the story. If you don't have accuracy, there's not much of a point in telling a story. You'll obviously also lose trust with the community that you're getting the stories from, and also the stories that you're talking about. Authenticity, of course, is also very important in that same vein. Obviously, you want to make sure the stories are authentic and pure, and obviously connected with the audiences that you are delivering the stories to. Diversity and representation is a really major piece to storytelling. I alluded to this a little bit at the Arab World Map. How do you tell the story of, again, folks coming from those 22 different countries, making sure that you have equal representation and equal diversity in the stories that you're telling? That's personally, and just being completely honest here, that's one of the challenges of the Arab American National Museum, is being able to tell the story of all 22 of these countries, all of the Arab Americans that connect with those countries, right? So, for example, in the U.S., which we'll talk a little bit about later, there are major populations of Arab Americans in several different states, in most states, but in most of these states, the largest communities that you'll find are Lebanese and Syrian, and that's wonderful. And that has to do with immigration trends. But again, how do you, if you have Lebanese and Syrian stories that are so readily available and you have all of these, that's great. But how do you make the playing field equal to get stories from communities that might not be in as large of numbers, like the Sudanese community, like the Somali community, like the Moroccan community? In Michigan, we have a huge Lebanese, Yemeni, Syrian, Iraqi, Palestinian, very Levant heavy population in Michigan, including Yemenis as well. So again, the challenge is, how do you get other communities that are not necessarily in your backyard to be a part of your institution? And that's something that we're struggling with, and we need to do a better job with, and we're recognizing that problem and trying to do that problem. And the other thing I'll say about diversity and representation is how do you make sure that you're representing fairly the folks that you're telling the stories of, right? So for example, Somalia, which was highlighted on our map, there are many Somalis that do not identify as as Arab, right? They'll identify specifically with Somali or Black or a wide variety of different identities. And so how do you be sensitive with telling their story and not labeling them as Arabs or Arab Americans, but again, labeling them in this larger framework, right? So for example, the term Swana, Southwest Asia, North Africa, that's become a really kind of self-identifying key that many Arab Americans have been using, and folks from these countries is using Southwest Asia, North Africa, or Swana as a way to identify folks because it's less exclusive, right? And it brings more folks into that identity and more folks. So folks are uncomfortable being labeled as Arab, but labeling as Swana, which is a kind of a taking back of the geographical term of the Middle East. Folks are comfortable with that identity because it's a little bit more inclusive versus saying, you know, oh, I'm Arab. So that's kind of a way that folks are kind of telling their own story by creating these identities that are more inclusive of folks beyond just this Arab identity. Building relationships, of course, also is very, very important. So, you know, if you're going to tell stories, the best way to do that, of course, is to form a relationship with these communities. So, you know, you can't necessarily just walk into a community and say, hi, I'm from the museum, or I'm from, you know, this classroom, and I want to tell the story. You know, I want to weave stories in about this community and expect to get a boatload of stories, right? It takes a lot of time to build relationships with communities to gain their trust, right? And possibly even repair some damage that's been done, perhaps, right? So those are all like factors to think about when building, when telling these stories, is there needs to be a firm relationship. And it takes a lot of work, right? It definitely takes a lot of work to build that trust and to get folks to be willing to tell their story. Also, relatability is a huge factor here. So again, making sure stories are relatable. That's one thing that I think the museum does a really, really good job of. You have the stories in our core exhibits, but then you also have docents and tour guides that are able to tell the story and kind of take the story and rework it so that it fits with the visitors that are coming through, right? And again, you cater the stories to our visitors that we have coming through, right? So if we have a bunch of Yemeni American youth that are coming for a tour, obviously, I'm not going to spend all of my time talking about the immigration story of Lebanese Americans or Syrian Americans. I'm going to focus, I'll weave some of that in, but you'll focus mostly on the stories that directly connect with that community. Because again, you're getting more out, there's more of a relatability, and folks will, quite bluntly, care more. You know, a lot of folks care more about the stories that directly connect to them. If you can weave it in with the larger kind of framework that you're presenting. As a quick example of that, as a Lebanese American, I remember when I was in school, I never learned anything in most of my classes about the Arab world or the Middle East or anything like that. If I did, it was in negative terms. It was something to do with America being this hero and saving the Arab world, or getting into politics in the Arab world and trying to fix a situation, which, you know, that obviously that's not the full story. But again, it was never really mentioned. But when they did talk about like Lebanon, for example, when I was in school, I would get so excited. I would beam, and I would raise my hand and be like, oh my gosh, I know about Lebanon. That's where I'm from. I would get so excited. And that's really what we see when we have youth that come to the Arab American National Museum, especially when we tell stories about their direct connection to their culture or their country of origin, things like that. And then lastly, utilizing materials around you is also super important. And that brings us into my next slide. I do want to check the chat because I'm seeing some folks come through. Oh, thank you. Wonderful. How do you select and find the stories you include in the museum? Come on, mouse. Are the exhibits rotating and evolving? That's a really good question. So in terms of like the exhibits, what we basically do is we I'll be again transparent. Back in the day when folks were collecting stories for the museum, what they did is they went out across the country and they collected all these different artifacts and stories and personal items like you see here on this slide. And they created the museum around this. Also 15, 20 years ago, most of the community members that folks were connecting with were from the Levant region. Obviously some Yemeni, some outside of the Levant region, but our museum, unfortunately, is very heavy Levant. And that has to do, again, with 20 years ago, that was the case. You had a lot, mostly, you know, in the Arab American community, you had a lot of folks from the Levant who had been here for generations. And also that was, you know, the majority of folks who were creating the museum were Levant. I think you had other folks as well, but it was very heavily Levant. And so we recognized that we need to do a better job at collecting items and stories from different communities. And so now we're going through and trying to build relationships with specific community members to grab these stories, grab these artifacts and stories, and again, to kind of like diversify our collections and our exhibits that we have on display. Also with the rotating exhibits, we're being very mindful of the types of temporary galleries that that exist. So we're bringing in diverse stories through our temporary exhibits, which are a little bit easier to maneuver than our permanent collection. So we are bringing different artists from different backgrounds, you know, Black and brown voices, queer artists and queer voices, different religious communities, and so on and so forth. And there are virtual tour options, which I will get to at the very end. That is also a really good question. So again, to get back to the presentation, so we're again talking about how we tell a story through different objects, right? So here at the museum, we identify several different, these are just a couple of examples of items that we utilize to tell stories, right? So for example, and I'll fast forward. So for example, we have a trunk where we get in front of the museum's Coming to America exhibit, which highlights immigration to the United States from the 22 different Arab countries. And so instead of just talking about, oh yeah, people immigrated all the time and they brought all these different items with them, what we do is we use this item, and this is a slide from one of our online presentations, and we make an activity out of it to get students to understand the difficulties of immigration to the United States. This is just one portion of that. And so instead of, again, like me just yammering on about how what the immigration story was like for folks, we'll have students or whatever groups, you know, do this activity, right? So it's like choose up to 7 different items you would pack in your suitcase and then write down why you would bring these items. And so it allows students to think about what they would bring. And so, you know, it allows them to say, oh my gosh, I can't bring and everything with me. I have to be very specific what I bring. I can only bring this one. Take clothes. Are you going to choose passports and documents? Are you going to take money? And it allows students to kind of put themselves in the shoes of an immigrant and make these difficult decisions, which we found is much more effective than me just yammering on again about, oh, this is what immigration stories are like. And then, of course, we use personal stories in our exhibit to tell the story of immigration to the United States. So we found that to be really, really impactful. We'll go through periods of immigration really quickly since I'm running out of time. I'm sorry. I apologize for dragging my feet with some of these slides. They're just so, I don't know, this is definitely my passion. Anyways, periods of immigration. So we'll talk about this really quickly. So again, when we talk about periods of immigration to the US, we talk about 4 distinct time periods. One being from the 1880s to the 1920s, this first period of immigration, where you mostly see single Christian men coming from Greater Syria. But again, to illustrate our point, we've included documents and images and stories from folks that tell a wider story, right? So even though this first time period, it's mostly single Christians from Lebanon and Syria, which is where you have this large Arab American Christian population until today, descendants of these folks. You also have Muslims that are coming over as well. So we have Joseph Hawar, who came from Palestine, who helped establish the first mosque in Washington, D.C. So this image here, this story, Joseph's story, tells us, you know, where he came from, that he changed his name somewhere along the way. And that, again, it's not just Christians, but it's Muslims coming over as well. To finish up this slide, the second time period of immigration is from the 1920s to the 1960s. You have the brain drain phenomena and many Palestinian refugees coming over in 1948 and kind of beyond that. And so again, we tell the story through Dr. Rashid Abdu, who is a part of this brain drain, right? Highly educated folks coming over during this time. And then we also, again, with the Palestinian refugees, we weave in different stories. And so here's an example of that, right? Here's scenario 1, you know, talking about the second time period of immigration. So the second time period of immigration began in 1925 and lasted until 1965. This period is defined by several groups coming to the US, including a large number of Palestinian families coming over as refugees. US legislation enacted in the early 1920s really slows down or stops immigrants coming to the US from most of the world and gives us this second period of immigration, right? Nothing wrong with that. Accurate, historical, we have dates, we have what's going on, we have why this wave took place, perfectly fine. This, however, and feel free if you prefer scenario 1 or scenario 2 to drop that in the chat, but scenario 2 covers what we talked about, right? It covers the year of the second time period, the Palestinian refugees coming over, and then it continues on. One of these refugees was Ahmed Ibrahim. Ahmed was born in Jimsu, Palestine in 1922, was forcibly removed from his home in 1948, and came to the US in the 1950s, leaving behind his family overseas, which we see here in this photograph from that Ahmed contributed to the museum, or his family contributed. And he's only able to bring a few items in his suitcase due to not being able to bring a lot with him, due to his status. A few items he brought, include his father's cane, some dirt, a rock from his homeland, and a little bit of money. So again, these personal stories again really help to kind of help to further the story that we're telling here, right? This image of Ahmed Ibrahim, his artifacts that we showcase, his items that we showcase really help to elaborate the story. And I see some questions and comments. I will get back to that in a moment, but I want to quickly wrap up my this period of immigration. So again, we have the third time period and the fourth time period here from the 1960s until the 1990s, and then from the 1990s up until present day. The third time period really focuses on Arab reunification, war and political conflict, economics, education, and a wide variety. This includes the Lebanese Civil War, which is where you start to see large populations of Arab Americans coming to the Dearborn area. And then the fourth time period from the 90s up until today has a lot to do with US intervention. Iraq, unfortunately, is a good example. The US invasion of Iraq in 2003 causes many Iraqis to flee Iraq because of economic situations, war, political conflict. Again, the US invasion, lack of opportunity, and that brings a lot of Iraqis to come over to the US. And a lot of these immigration numbers are matched with what's going on overseas. So for example, after 2003, the numbers of Iraqis coming to the US really, really skyrockets after that point because again of this intervention. Okay. So here we're looking at a map of the countries that, the states that have really large Arab American populations. Based off of this map, any guesses as to which state has the largest overall population of Arab Americans? Any guesses? Good, good. This usually trips people up. This is really great. Yeah, so California. So California actually has the largest overall concentration of Arab Americans. They're much more spread out though. Michigan, of course, has the highest concentration of Arab Americans, centered, of course, around the Southeast Metro Detroit region. Why though? Why would so many Arabs immigrate initially to Michigan? What would bring so many Arab Americans to come up to Michigan? Very good. Oh, very good. Yeah, absolutely. So the Ford industry and then also family, right? You go where you know someone, family reunification. So this is absolutely correct. So we have the auto industry that really brought a lot of Arab Americans to Michigan. And the reason I wanted to include this is because, again, when you think of the auto industry, we mostly think of Arab, in the case of Arab Americans at least, we mostly assume that it's Arab men that are coming over working in this industry. But that's not always the case, right? You also have Arab American women, such as Eva Habib, who's focused here, who were working in the auto industry back in the 1920s in this case, right? And so, you know, it's really important, again, to showcase these stories. We have oral histories, which I don't know if I'll have time to show, but we also have oral histories of folks whose families have worked historically in the auto industry and what that was like to work in the auto industry back in the day as an Arab immigrant, where your language may not be super strong and you may have had certain issues that have come up. So these examples have been captured in our oral histories.
Hey, Dave,
and of course through photographs.
Oh. Hey, Dave, we've only got about a minute left and we're going to be heading out to our other session. So just wanted to give you a chance to wrap up. And again, I know there's lots of questions people want to follow up with you on, and they may want to contact you for that as well.
Sure. No, that sounds good, Dave. Thank you for the or was that Stan? Thank you, whoever that was.
Stan, it was Stan, yep.
Oh, sorry, Stan. Thank you. Thank you for the time check. So I am going to skip down to our resources. We'll skip this. So these are just ways that Arab Americans kind of tell their story through activism, through food, as you mentioned, as I just scrolled through arts and music and culture. Lastly, to tell the story of Arab Americans, we have a wide variety of tools. So we have our tours and presentations. So these are all the things we are offering. Live virtual tours. We have a virtual tour package for educators that folks can kind of pick and choose from and utilize in their classrooms. We do presentations, trainings for educators on the Arab American community, different crafts such as mosaics, debke, film, evil eye bracelets, object-based learning, dialogue groups around immigration, things like that. And then lastly, we have a bunch of resources for folks to utilize. So we have our lesson plans, our traveling exhibits that visit schools and libraries and beyond that. We have our Arab American booklets, which is found online. We also have digital scrapbooks that folks can utilize. We have From the Archives, which is videos that we've done created around our exhibits. We have our youth photography program, which is called Sura, which utilizes photography for students to tell their own story, which we're trying to bring into classrooms so that students can tell their own story through the art of photography. We also have our books and published materials. Folks can access our collections, and we have like different websites such as Reclaiming Identity, Dismantling Stereotypes. Sorry to rush towards the end, but this is my contact information. If you'd like to take a screenshot, or I think this is being recorded, you can certainly connect with me. Beyond that, apologies, I did not get to a bunch of to the questions in there, but I will in the chat. I'm going to drop my contact information just in case you didn't get a chance to look at it. And I'm also going to drop in the museum's website, so you can go to the museum's website and check out our different resources. We have a huge tab for, oh, thank you, who dropped that into the chat. So that's also the museum's website. So you can go and check out all of our resources. And again, please connect with me for educational opportunities, for any questions I did not get a chance to answer. And again, thank you very, very much for this time, and apologies for rushing towards the end.
Dave, thanks so much. Thanks for being with us. Again, lots of resources. I think people in the chat also mentioned that they're going to make sure that they now have a chance to get to Dearborn and see the museum. So thank you so much for doing that as well today. We're going to head to our break. Again, we thank you so much for spending time with us on Saturday, and enjoy the stories we tell, and have a great conference experience.
Dave, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, Dave. I just want to say hi. It's Michelle Cureton.
Hi, Michelle.
Great job.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.